A land of ancient dynasties and whispered philosophies, of towering mountains and vast fertile plains. For millennia, China stood as the undisputed Middle Kingdom, a civilization so vast, so self-contained, that the outside world was little more than a distant hum, a peripheral curiosity. Its emperors ruled over a realm they believed to be the center of all under heaven, a place where harmony, tradition, and self-sufficiency reign supreme. Yet to understand the assertive, complex China of today, we must journey back not just decades, but centuries to a series of encounters that irrevocably shaped its destiny and forged an enduring, often wary view of the West. The story of modern China is not merely one of economic rise or geopolitical ambition. It's a saga of humiliation and resistance, of invasion and reinvention, a deeply etched historical memory that informs every strategic decision, every diplomatic stance. For China, the West is not just a collection of nations. It's a historical force that once brought an empire to its knees. For centuries, China operated on its own terms. Its exquisite silks, coveted porcelains, and aromatic teas were highly desired across Europe, creating an insatiable demand. Yet China itself imported very little from the West. This created a massive and persistent trade imbalance. European merchants had to pay for Chinese goods almost exclusively in silver. Huge quantities of precious metal flowed eastwards, draining Western coffers and becoming a growing source of frustration for imperial powers like Britain. The British, desperate to balance this trade deficit, searched for a commodity China would buy in large quantities. Their answer came in a potent, insidious form: opium. Grown in British India, opium was smuggled into China by the British East India Company, and later by private British and American traders. This was not a slow, organic trade. It was a deliberate, aggressive saturation of a market, turning millions into addicts. The drug ravaged Chinese society, draining its silver reserves and weakening the populace. Families were destroyed, productivity plummeted, and social order began to fray. The Qing dynasty, witnessing the catastrophic impact, recognized the existential threat. In 1839, a courageous imperial commissioner, Lin Zexu, was dispatched to Canton, modern-day Guangzhou, the heart of the opium trade. He acted decisively, seizing and destroying over 20,000 chests of opium, a massive quantity, and demanding that foreign merchants sign pledges to cease all future opium trade. His actions were a clear assertion of Chinese sovereignty and a desperate attempt to save his people. But Britain saw Lin Zexu's actions not as legitimate, but to a public health crisis, but as an intolerable assault on free trade and the property of British subjects. The British Parliament, after heated debate, voted for military action. The stated purpose of the war was to uphold Britain's commercial rights and to protect its citizens. But the underlying motivation was clear: to force China to open its markets to all goods, including opium, and to secure greater economic concessions. It was a cynical calculation of profit over humanity. The First Opium War was a brutal awakening for China. Chinese ships and ancient cannons were just no match for British steamships and modern artillery. The British fleet swiftly overwhelmed coastal defenses, bombarded cities, and disrupted vital waterways. The resulting Treaty of Nanjing, forced upon a humiliated Qing dynasty, was the first of many unequal treaties. It ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 treaty ports to foreign trade, and granted Britain extraterritoriality, meaning British subjects in China were exempt from Chinese law. This was followed by the Second Opium War in 1856, which led to more concessions, including the legalization of the opium trade. These wars and treaties cemented the perception of Western aggression, cynical exploitation, and a blatant disregard for Chinese sovereignty. It was a wound that never truly healed, a bitter beginning to China's century of humiliation. And into this crucible of humiliation and internal strife, a new, bizarre chapter unfolded: the Taiping Rebellion. Imagine a young man, Hong Jingquan, a Haku schoolteacher, after failing imperial examinations multiple times, suffering a nervous breakdown. During his recovery, he experienced visions and, influenced by Christian missionary pamphlets he vaguely understood, emerged convinced he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to establish a heavenly kingdom on earth. His movement, blending a unique syncretic form of Christian theology with ancient Chinese communal ideals and a fervent anti-Manchu, anti-Qing dynasty sentiment, ignited the most devastating civil war in human history. From 1850 to 1864, tens of millions perished, arguably the deadliest conflict before the 20th century world wars. Initially, Western powers, fresh from their Opium War victories and already establishing their spheres of influence, watched with a mix of curiosity and opportunism. Some missionaries saw a chance for widespread conversion, some merchants for new markets in the rebel-controlled territories. As the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom gained ground, establishing its capital in Nanjing and threatening the stability of the Qing dynasty, and by extension Western trade interests, treaty ports, and existing concessions, the calculations shifted. Western nations began to realize that the king, though weak, was a known entity and easier to control. A victorious Taiping regime with its radical ideology and xenophobic tendencies might prove far less amenable to foreign demands. So British, American, and French forces, initially neutral or even tactically sympathetic to the rebels, began to throw their weight, often covertly, behind the beleaguered Qing government. Figures like Frederick Townsend Ward, an American mercenary, later Chinese Gordon, a celebrated British officer, led foreign trade armies and supplied modern weaponry that proved instrumental in crushing the Taiping forces. They ensured the survival of a weak, debt-ridden Qing regime that was far more pliable to Western demands. For China, it was another bitter lesson. Western engagement was rarely altruistic. It was always about self-interest, often expressed through opportunism, interference, and ultimately ensuring a compliant partner, even if that meant propping up an ailing empire against its own people. The Qing dynasty eventually crumbled in 1911, leading to decades of internal chaos, warlordism, and foreign invasion, particularly from Imperial Japan. The Chinese Civil War, a titanic struggle between the nationalists and the communists, became another stage for Western influence. The U.S., fresh from its victory in World War II, largely backed Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, providing significant financial aid, military equipment, and advisors. Washington hoped to see a stable, unified, and democratic China under nationalist leadership, aligned with Western interests in the post-World War global order. Yet despite this substantial support, Mao Zedong's Communists ultimately triumphed in 1949, sending the nationalists fleeing to Taiwan. For the newly established People's Republic of China, this American backing of their Civil War enemies was a defining moment. It reinforced a deep-seated distrust of Western intentions, viewing them as attempts to dictate China's internal politics, prop up favored regimes, and prevent China's true independence and self-determination. Mao famously declared, "The Chinese people have stood up," a direct repudiation of the century of humiliation and perceived Western meddling, a promise that China would never again be dictated to by foreign powers. And what did this new defiant China become? For decades, it was viewed through a purely ideological lens by the West, a communist monolith, an economic failure, isolated behind an iron curtain. Yet after Mao's death, something remarkable happened. While maintaining its single-party rule and socialist political system, China embarked on an unprecedented economic reform under Deng Xiaoping, often summarized as socialism with Chinese characteristics. They didn't adopt Western democracy, but they embraced key aspects of market liberalization and integrated into the global economy. As figures like former Congressman Ron Paul and many economists have observed, by unleashing the productive power of its people through private enterprise, foreign investment, and open trade, China tapped into a fundamentally human drive. This pragmatic approach, learned through bitter experience, was not about pleasing the West, but about lifting China back to its rightful place through a unique path of development, often in defiance of Western prescriptions. They selectively adopted what worked, discarding or adapting what didn't fit their historical context or political system. So how does this long, turbulent history, steeped in humiliation, resistance, and resurgence shape China's view of the West today. First, there is an ingrained distrust of Western intentions. When the US and its allies speak of democracy promotion, human rights, or rules-based international order, Beijing often hears echoes of 19th century gunboat diplomacy and 20th century interference. They frequently view these concepts as pretexts for undermining their sovereignty, for containing their rise, or for keeping China down. The historical memory of external powers dictating China's internal affairs is exceptionally strong. Second, there is a profound emphasis on national unity and absolute sovereignty. The memory of being carved up by foreign powers and facing internal rebellions supported by outsiders fuels an intense sensitivity over issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. From Beijing's perspective, these are sacred internal affairs, critical to its territorial integrity and national cohesion. Western criticism or intervention on these matters is consistently perceived as another form of historical interference, a new iteration of the unequal treaties that once dismembered China. Third, China is driven by a deep-seated desire for respect and its rightful place in the world. After enduring a century of humiliation, followed by isolation, its economic and geopolitical rise is not just about power. It's a profound reclamation of a status, a reassertion of its historical role as a great civilization. When the West criticizes China's governance, its global ambitions, or its development model, China often perceives it as an attempt to deny its legitimate resurgence and maintain a Western-centric global hierarchy that Beijing believes is obsolete. Finally, China's approach to global power and international relations is deeply shaped by its experience. It champions multipolarity and the notion that no single power or bloc should dominate global affairs, a clear reaction to its past subjugation by a unipolar or Western-dominated world. It actively promotes its own development model, one that prioritizes state-led growth, stability, and pragmatic economic engagement over Western, liberal, democratic ideals as a viable alternative for developing nations. This is not just foreign policy, it's a direct historical response. The West often sees China as a rising challenger, a geopolitical rival, a communist state. But from Beijing's perspective, it's a nation that has endured centuries of external aggression and internal turmoil, resisted and finally triumphed over historical forces that sought to control and exploit it. The scars of the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the Civil War and decades of isolation run deep. Understanding China requires more than just analyzing its current economic data or military buildup. It demands acknowledging the centuries of interaction, the moments of profound humiliation, and the long, slow climb back to power through a unique path. Until the West truly grapples with China's historical narrative and its enduring view of foreign intervention, the path to mutual understanding will remain as fraught as it always has been. The dragon, having awoken from its long slumber, remembers the fires that once threatened to consume it, and it will never again allow itself to be put to sleep.